1950s Hollywood. Tourists are taking photos by the parks and palm trees, and on a hill stands a house that looks like it fell out of another time. This is Greystone, a luxurious Gilded Age mansion where the dark story of Hollywood's Gilded Age mansion Greystone begins. Today it's rented out for movies, weddings, and photo shoots, but almost none of the guests know that in one of these rooms, 2 bodies were found. A young heir to an oil millionaire and his closest assistant. The official version? A sudden nervous breakdown and suicide. The unofficial one, a quiet crime that had to be buried fast while an empire of oil and corruption was cracking. The police arrived late. Testimonies contradicted each other. Traces disappeared. The family kept silent, and the mansion itself was turned into a beautiful set, meant to erase the memory of that nighttime shooting. Why did a house with a double death inside become one of Hollywood's favorite filming locations? And who were Greystone's walls really protecting? The dead or the living? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. The Prospector Who Struck Oil. And speaking of families who built these places, the Greystone story begins not with stone or mortar, but with a man covered in dust and debt. Edward Lawrence Doheny arrived in Los Angeles in 1892 with little more than a miner's instincts and a willingness to gamble everything on a single hunch. He had spent years chasing silver in Arizona and New Mexico, and failed. Then he went after gold in the mountains, and failed again. By his late 30s, he was broke, sunburned, and running out of chances. But Doheny noticed something others had ignored. The man driving a cart through the streets of Los Angeles had wheels slicked with a dark, oily substance. Doheny stopped him and asked where it came from. The answer? A tar pit at the edge of town, where the stuff bubbled up from the ground like a wound that would not close. Most people saw a nuisance, something sticky and useless. Doheny saw fortune. He borrowed money. He found a partner. Together, they dug by hand near what is now downtown Los Angeles, using a sharpened eucalyptus tree trunk as a makeshift drill. At 160 feet, they struck oil. That single well changed everything. Within 5 years, the Los Angeles basin was covered with derricks. Doheny moved fast, buying up leases, building pipelines, expanding into Mexico, where the fields were even richer. By the early 1900s, he controlled one of the largest oil operations in the Western Hemisphere. His wealth reportedly reached the hundreds of millions, a staggering sum for the era. But money alone could not buy what Doheny wanted most: acceptance. The oil business was rough, noisy, and stained with grease. It was associated with speculators and wildcatters, not with the genteel families of the East Coast who traced their fortunes to railroads and banking. Doheny had the money of a Rockefeller, but he lacked the pedigree. He was a self-made man, in an age when that phrase carried both admiration and suspicion. His only son, Edward Lawrence Doheny Jr., known to everyone as Ned, grew up watching his father fight for respect. The family moved through grand hotels and rented mansions, never quite settling, never quite belonging. Ned was educated at the best schools. He married well. He joined his father's business. But he too carried the burden of proving that the Doheny name meant something beyond oil derricks and dirty money. Edward Sr. understood that in America, architecture could do what bloodlines could not. A grand house on a prominent hill could announce to the world that a family had arrived, that they were permanent, that they mattered. So when he looked at the empty slopes above the young city of Beverly Hills, he saw more than real estate. He saw a chance to build a monument, not for himself. He was getting old. But for Ned, for the grandchildren, for generations of Dohenys who would never have to explain where their money came from. What he did not see was that the house he was about to build would become famous not for its beauty, but for what happened inside its walls. Chapter 3. Building Greystone. Hugh Plunkett was not the only one carrying weight up that hill. Thousands of workers carried it too, in limestone blocks, in hand-carved beams, in loads of slate shipped from quarries 3,000 miles away. Construction began in 1927. The site was a steep, uneven slope above Beverly Hills, still mostly open land dotted with oak trees and wild grass. Turning it into an estate worthy of the Doheny name would require engineering as much as architecture. First, the hill itself had to be reshaped. Crews carved terraces into the slope, cutting away earth to create flat platforms for the house, the gardens, and the service buildings. Retaining walls went up to hold the hillside in place. Drainage systems were laid out to push rainwater away from the foundations. The work was slow, brutally hard, and largely invisible. The kind of labor that vanishes beneath lawns and flower beds. Then came the stone. Gordon Kaufman had specified Indiana limestone for the exterior walls. This was not a local material. It had to be quarried in the Midwest, cut into blocks, loaded onto rail cars, and sent across the country to Los Angeles. Each block was numbered and cataloged, then lifted into place according to Kaufman's drawings. The masons worked by hand, shaping the stone with chisels and hammers, tapping and adjusting until the joints were so tight that some sections still appear almost seamless today. The scale was enormous. 55 rooms, 46,000 square feet of interior space, a basement that included a bowling alley, a billiard room, and a hidden bar. Prohibition was still in effect, but the Dohenys clearly planned for the day when it would end. The service wing alone was larger than most houses, with quarters for a staff of servants, cooks, and groundskeepers. Inside, the craftsmanship matched the ambition. Ceilings were paneled in hand-carved oak, each beam fitted and finished by carpenters trained in old European traditions. Fireplaces were faced in marble imported from Italy. Hardware, doorknobs, hinges, light fixtures, was custom cast in bronze. The great hall held a pipe organ, its console built into the woodwork, so that music felt like part of the architecture, not an added feature. The cost reportedly exceeded $3 million, equivalent to well over $50 million today. Some estimates put the final figure even higher, though the family's records are incomplete. What is clear is that Edward Doheny was building not just a residence, but an argument in stone. Every carved detail, every imported material, every hand-finished surface was meant to announce permanence, taste, and legitimacy. But for whom? The house was officially a wedding gift for Ned and his wife, Lucy. They had married in 1914 and already had 5 children by the time construction began. The family needed space, certainly, but a 55-room mansion was more than space. It was a declaration. Edward Sr. never intended to live at Greystone himself. He had his own estate, a grand property called Chester Place, near downtown Los Angeles. Greystone was for the next generation, for Ned, for Lucy, for the grandchildren who would grow up running through its halls and gardens. It was meant to be the physical foundation of a dynasty. Yet even as the house rose, the family remained under scrutiny. The Teapot Dome trials dragged on. Ned's name appeared in newspapers alongside words like scandal and bribery. Hugh Plunkett, still serving as Ned's secretary and confidant, grew more anxious. Some accounts describe him as increasingly erratic, drinking heavily, sleeping poorly, convinced that the legal troubles would never truly end. By late 1928, Greystone was nearly complete. The gardens were planted. The furniture was arriving. The family prepared to move in, What should have been a triumph felt to some observers more like a retreat, a family withdrawing behind walls of stone, hoping that beauty and permanence could outweigh everything that had come before. They moved in just after the new year. February was less than 5 weeks away. Chapter 4. 5 Children and a Shadow 5 Weeks. That was all the time the Doheny family would have in their new home before everything changed. In January 1929, Ned and Lucy finally moved into Greystone with their 5 children. The oldest was barely a teenager. The youngest was still in the nursery. For them, the mansion must have felt like a palace from a storybook. Endless hallways to explore, gardens that seemed to stretch to the horizon, a bowling alley in the basement where their laughter echoed off the stone and wood. The family settled into a rhythm. Breakfast in the sunny morning room, lessons with tutors in the library, afternoons in the gardens, where the children played among fountains and terraces while their mother watched from the stone balustrade. In the evenings, the great hall filled with music from the pipe organ, its notes drifting through the house like something left over from another century. From the outside, it looked like everything Edward Sr. had hoped for. His son established in a magnificent home, his grandchildren growing up surrounded by beauty and apparent stability. The Doheny name finally attached to something grander than oil wells, courtrooms, and hostile headlines. But inside the gates, the shadows had followed them up the hill. Ned was not well. The years of hearings and headlines had taken their toll. He reportedly suffered from chronic insomnia, lying awake at night while the newly built house creaked and settled around him. Some accounts describe anxiety, sharp mood swings, a constant sense that the family's troubles were far from over. He had testified before Congress. He had watched his father be humiliated in the press. He had carried that black bag of cash into Albert Fall's hotel room, and no matter how many times the courts declared the Dohenys innocent, he knew that people would always wonder. And then there was Hugh. Hugh Plunkett had been Ned's closest companion for years. Part secretary, part confidant, almost a brother. They had grown up together inside the Doheny world, worked side by side, and weathered the scandal as a pair. Hugh lived on the Greystone estate in quarters near the main house, always close at hand when Ned needed him. But Hugh was struggling. The pressure of the Teapot Dome investigation had reportedly pushed him toward a breakdown. He drank. He slept poorly. He complained of headaches and a constant sense of danger, convinced that enemies were watching the family, that telephones were not safe, that the scandal would never truly end. Some accounts suggest he had been showing signs of serious mental illness for months before the move to Greystone. Lucy noticed. The servants noticed. Even the children, young as they were, sensed that something was wrong with their father's friend. The man who had always been part of the household, who now seemed distant and tense, his eyes carrying a weight that no one could quite explain to them. Ned tried to help. He reportedly arranged for Hugh to see doctors, to step back from work, to rest and recover. But the two men remained bound together by more than friendship. They shared secrets. They had been in that hotel room together. Whatever happened in the years ahead, their fates were tied to the same story. The last weeks of January passed. The household staff went about their routines. Cooking in the new kitchens, cleaning the vast rooms, tending the gardens that were still taking root in the freshly turned soil. The children played. Lucy managed the enormous house with the quiet efficiency expected of a woman in her position, keeping schedules, supervising staff, maintaining appearances. And somewhere in the guest wing, behind a door that would soon become infamous, 2 men carried burdens that no mansion, however grand, could lift. On the night of February 16, 1929, the children were put to bed as usual. Ned said goodnight to each of them, then walked toward the guest wing where Hugh was staying. What happened next would turn Greystone from a monument of ambition into a crime scene, and transform the Doheny family's dream of permanence into a mystery that has never been fully solved. Chapter 5. The Night the Guns Echoed. The mystery begins with sounds that no one can quite agree on. February 16th, 1929. A Saturday night. The children were asleep in their rooms. Lucy was elsewhere in the house. Accounts differ on exactly where. The servants had finished their evening duties and retired to their quarters. Greystone was quiet, its stone walls holding the silence like a vault. Sometime around 11 o'clock, gunshots shattered that silence. Or was it 2 shots? Or 3? The testimonies would later conflict. Some staff members reported hearing a heavy thud, then shots. Others swore they heard only the commotion afterward. The house was enormous, 46,000 square feet of stone and oak, and sound moved unpredictably through its corridors and stairwells. What is known is this: at some point that night, a member of the household staff found the door to a guest room locked. Knocking brought no answer. Voices in the hallway, no response. Eventually, the door was opened. How and by whom remains unclear in the historical record. Inside, 2 men lay dead. Ned Doheny, 35 years old, heir to one of the largest oil fortunes in America, was on the floor. He had been shot in the head. Near him lay Hugh Plunkett, also dead from a gunshot wound. A revolver was reportedly found close to Hugh's hand. The police were called, but not right away. Here the story starts to fracture. Some accounts suggest that the family's personal physician, Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh, arrived at the scene before law enforcement. Others hint that several hours passed between the discovery of the bodies and the first official report. The exact timeline has never been pinned down with certainty. When detectives finally reached Greystone, they walked into a room that had already been disturbed. The bodies had reportedly been moved. The guest room had been entered by multiple people. Whatever physical evidence might have clarified what happened that night had been handled, shifted, or removed, whether out of panic, grief, or intention. The official investigation was remarkably brief. Within days, the Los Angeles County District Attorney announced his conclusion. Hugh Plunkett, suffering from a nervous breakdown made worse by the stress of the Teapot Dome scandal, had shot Ned Doheny and then turned the gun on himself. Murder-suicide. Case closed. The explanation was neat, maybe too neat. Questions surfaced almost immediately. Why would Hugh kill the man who had been his closest friend, his employer, his protector inside the Doheny world? If Hugh was known to be unstable, why had he been allowed to remain in the household, with access to firearms? Just steps away from a family with 5 young children. Why had the police been called so late? Why had the scene been touched at all? Before investigators arrived? Then there were the physical details. Some who examined the evidence, or what remained of it, noted that the bullet paths did not sit comfortably with the official story. The way the bodies were positioned raised doubts. The location of the weapon raised more. Rumors rippled through Los Angeles society. One version whispered that Ned had actually shot Hugh, perhaps in self-defense, and had then been killed by a second gunman. Another suggested that the entire tableau had been staged to shield someone, though who that someone might have been, and from what, no one could say with certainty. A darker line of speculation tied the deaths directly to Teapot Dome, framing them as the violent silencing of men who knew too much. None of these theories has ever been proven. On paper, the official verdict still stands: murder-suicide, committed by a man whose mind had broken under pressure. But the speed of the investigation, the enormous influence of the Doheny family, and the convenient closure of a case that might have exposed deeper secrets All of that has left historians and researchers uneasy for nearly a century. The stone walls of Greystone kept their silence. And a family that had built a mansion to escape scandal now found itself at the center of a mystery that would never fully go away. Chapter 6. Widow on the Hill. The mystery might remain unsolved, but the grief was immediate and absolute. Lucy Doheny was 34 years old. She had 5 children under the age of 14. She had been married to Ned for 15 years. And now she was alone, in a 55-room mansion where her husband had died violently, in circumstances that would never be fully explained. The funeral was held within days. Ned was buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery in a private service. The Doheny family closed ranks, refused interviews, and declined to comment on the investigation, stepping back behind lawyers and publicists who issued carefully polished statements. The line was simple. The matter was closed. The family was grieving, and the public should look elsewhere for scandal. But Lucy could not look elsewhere. She had to live in the house. Imagine waking each morning in a mansion that was supposed to represent a fresh start, a clean slate, a monument to your family's arrival among the American elite. Imagine walking past the guest wing where your husband died. Imagine explaining to your children, the oldest barely a teenager, the youngest still needing help to dress, why their father was gone and why strangers kept asking questions. The guest room where Ned and Hugh were found reportedly remained closed for years. Some accounts suggest it was locked permanently, the door left untouched, as if sealing the room could somehow contain what had happened inside. Servants whispered about avoiding that hallway. Visitors later recalled a strange heaviness in that part of the house, a sense that something lingered there that should not be disturbed. Lucy stayed. That choice alone says more than any public statement. Many widows in her position would have sold the property, escaped the memories, and started over somewhere untouched by tragedy. The Doheny fortune was more than sufficient to buy any house in the country. She could have raised her children in Europe, in New York, in any place where the name Greystone did not carry the weight of a double death. But she remained on the hill. For over 2 decades, Lucy Doheny lived at Greystone, raising her 5 children in the house her father-in-law had built. The reasons were never recorded. Perhaps she felt that leaving would be an admission of defeat, a surrender to the scandal that had chased the family for so long. Perhaps she believed her children needed stability, even in a home shadowed by violence. Perhaps she simply could not imagine any other place as theirs. Edward Doheny Sr. did not long survive his son, the old prospector who had struck oil in a Los Angeles tar pit, who had built an empire spanning 2 continents, who had endured congressional investigations and criminal trials. He died in 1935, 6 years after Ned's death. Some said he never recovered from the loss. He was buried at Forest Lawn, near the son for whom he had built Greystone, the son who had lived there for only 5 weeks. The children grew up in the mansion's shadow. They played in the gardens, attended schools in Los Angeles, and came of age during the Depression and the Second World War. Whatever they knew or suspected about their father's death, they kept to themselves. The Doheny habit of silence held. Meanwhile, the world around Greystone was changing. Beverly Hills was no longer a quiet foothill community. It was becoming the center of the American film industry, home to movie stars and moguls who built their own mansions on the slopes below the Doheny estate. Each year the city crept closer, its lights visible from the terraces where Lucy's children had once played. The house that was built to establish a dynasty was slowly becoming an island, a relic of another era, surrounded by a city moving too fast to remember why it had mattered so much to the people who first climbed that hill. Chapter 7. Hollywood discovers the palace. The city did not forget Greystone. It simply found a different use for it. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the film industry had turned Los Angeles into the entertainment capital of the world. Studios needed locations. Grand houses, formal gardens, backdrops that could stand in for European castles or East Coast estates. And there, on the hill above Beverly Hills, sat a 55-room Tudor mansion that looked like it had been shipped in from another century. The first film crews arrived while Lucy and the children were still living on the property. At the beginning, the arrangement was discreet. Studios rented portions of the grounds, the lawns, the exterior terraces. Cameras caught the stone facades and manicured hedges without ever showing who actually lived inside. For the Dohenys, it became a quiet source of income in uncertain years. For Hollywood, it was a ready-made illusion. A palace that needed no carpenters, no temporary sets, no plaster castles that would be torn down after shooting. The irony was sharp, even if no one said it out loud. A house built to prove the family's legitimacy, their permanence, their place among an American aristocracy was now being used as a tool for make-believe. The stone walls that were supposed to shield the Doheny name became scenery for fictional dramas, the real history pushed into the shadows every time a new production rolled its cameras. As the children grew older and left, Lucy used less and less of the enormous house. Entire wings stood empty and dark. The household staff shrank. The gardens, once maintained by a small army of groundskeepers, were simplified and scaled back. The estate that had cost millions to create now felt too large, too expensive, and too loaded with memories for a single aging widow. The film crews noticed the space. They began asking for access to interior rooms. The great hall with its pipe organ, the sweeping staircase, the wood-paneled library. Each rental brought strangers deeper into the house, their lights and cables threading through spaces where the Doheny children had once played, where Ned had paced during sleepless nights, where servants had whispered about the guest room that remained permanently closed. Outside the gates, Beverly Hills was booming. The post-war years brought new fortunes, new construction, new residents who cared nothing about oil scandals or Gilded Age dynasties. Developers studied the Doheny acreage with open ambition. 400 acres of prime hillside land, much of it still open, sat above one of the most desirable zip codes in America. Lucy began to sell. Parcels of the original estate were cut off and subdivided. New streets appeared where there had been open fields. Luxury houses rose on land that had once been Doheny pasture. The city climbed the hill, wrapping around the mansion on three sides and turning Greystone from a country estate into an urban anomaly. A 46,000-square-foot castle stranded in a grid of mid-century homes. By the early 1950s, the estate had shrunk to a fraction of its original size. The mansion and its immediate gardens remained, but the vast grounds that Edward Doheny had assembled to project baronial grandeur were gone. What had once been a statement of dynasty had become simply a very large house on a much smaller piece of land. Lucy was aging. The children had their own homes, their own families, their own reasons to stay away from the place where their father had died. The question was no longer whether to keep Greystone, but what would happen to it when no Doheny remained to walk its halls. The answer was coming, and it would be nothing like what the builders of Greystone had imagined. Chapter 8, For Sale, A Haunted Palace. What no one expected was how quickly the family would let go, and how uncertain the mansion's future would become. In 1955, Lucy Doheny finally made the decision that had been building for years. She sold Greystone. After more than 2 decades as a widow in a house built for dynasty, she walked away from the stone walls, the terraced gardens, the long driveway, and the guest room that had remained closed since that February night in 1929. The buyer was Paul Trousdale, a developer whose name would soon be stamped across the hillsides of Beverly Hills. Trousdale was not interested in preservation. He was interested in profit. He looked at Greystone and saw not a historic mansion, not an architectural landmark, not a monument to the Gilded Age. He saw land. Acres of prime real estate that could be subdivided, developed, and sold to wealthy buyers eager for a Beverly Hills address. For Trousdale, the mansion itself was almost an inconvenience. A 55-room house required constant maintenance, a sizable staff, ongoing repairs. It generated property taxes but no real income. It sat on ground that could hold dozens of new luxury homes, each one worth more per square foot than the aging estate occupying the hilltop. He seriously considered demolition. Plans were drafted. Engineers studied the site. The mansion that Edward Doheny had ordered built to last for generations, that had survived scandal, a double death, and decades of film crews, now faced a threat more final than any ghost story: the simple math of Los Angeles real estate. While Trousdale calculated profits, he treated the property as a temporary asset and leased it to anyone willing to pay. Film studios continued to rent the grounds and the interiors. For a time, the American Film Institute used the mansion for classes and screenings. Greystone became a strange hybrid, part movie set, part film school, part abandoned monument waiting for the wrecking ball. And the ghost stories multiplied. Caretakers reported footsteps in empty corridors. Doors that had been locked were found standing open. Lights flickered in rooms where no one had been for hours. Some staff refused to enter certain areas after dark, especially the wing where Ned and Hugh had died. Whether these accounts reflected something unexplained or simply the power of suggestion in a house with such a past, they added another layer to Greystone's reputation. The mansion became known not just as a filming location, but as one of the most haunted houses in Southern California. Ghost hunters requested access. Journalists ran sensational features about the Doheny tragedy and its supposed supernatural aftermath. The serious history of oil wealth, political scandal, and unresolved death became tangled with tales of spectral figures, cold spots, and disembodied sounds. Trousdale, meanwhile, was transforming the land below the mansion at a furious pace. The neighborhood that bears his name today, Trousdale Estates, rose on the slopes beneath Greystone, filled with sleek mid-century modern homes that represented everything the old mansion was not. Clean horizontal lines instead of Tudor complexity, glass and steel instead of limestone, forward-looking optimism instead of backward-looking grandeur. By the early 1960s, the mansion stood alone. The last remnants of the original Doheny acreage had been sold off. The gardens were overgrown, paint peeled from window frames. Rain found its way through gaps in the slate roof. The house that had cost millions to build was now a liability, kept standing with minimal effort, waiting for a decision that never quite arrived. Trousdale still owned the property. He still weighed demolition, but something, the numbers on a spreadsheet, a flicker of sentiment or simple inertia, kept the wrecking ball away from the hilltop. The mansion remained standing, barely. And the question of its survival began to shift from a developer's balance sheet to the desks of city officials who would have to decide whether Greystone was worth saving at all. Chapter 9. The Edge of the Cliff. The decision landed on those desks at the worst possible moment. By the early 1960s, Beverly Hills was a city in transition. The quiet residential community of the pre-war years had turned into something louder, flashier, and far more expensive. Land values climbed year after year. New construction crept across every available hillside. The pressure to build was intense, and Greystone still sat on some of the most valuable, undeveloped acreage in the entire city. Paul Trousdale made his position clear. He had no interest in propping up a deteriorating mansion that generated no real revenue. He wanted to subdivide the remaining property, tear down the house, and replace it with luxury homes that would sell at prices matching Beverly Hills' new identity as one of the wealthiest communities in America. On paper, the numbers were flawless. The market was hungry. The only thing in the way was a crumbling shell of limestone that many locals now associated more with old scandals and ghost stories than with history. The city council faced a choice that would define Beverly Hills' relationship to its own past. On one side stood the developers and their supporters. They argued that Greystone was a private property issue, that the mansion had no special claim on public money, that the land would produce far more tax revenue as a subdivision than as a single aging estate. Progress, they said, required sacrifice. Los Angeles had already watched dozens of historic mansions fall to development. One more would barely be noticed. On the other side was a smaller, quieter coalition. Historians who understood Greystone's architectural importance. Preservationists who had seen too many landmarks flattened by bulldozers. Neighbors who valued the open space and mature trees the estate still protected. And a few city officials who sensed that Beverly Hills was in real danger of erasing the very past that gave it character. The debates were sharp and emotional. Public meetings drew passionate speakers on both sides. Letters poured into local newspapers. Some insisting the city stay out of private business, others pleading for action before one more landmark vanished. While the politicians argued, Greystone continued to rot. Rain seeped through gaps in the slate roof, damaging the hand-carved ceilings that had taken craftsmen months to complete. Paint curled away from exterior trim. The gardens, once groomed by a full-time crew, grew wild with weeds and uncut hedges. Vandals shattered windows. Squatters reportedly slipped into unused rooms. The bowling alley in the basement sat silent, its lanes warped by moisture and neglect. Preservationists documented every new wound, hoping that photographs of crumbling plaster and water-stained oak panels would sway public opinion. They brought in architectural historians to testify about Greystone's importance, one of the finest Tudor Revival mansions in California, designed by Gordon Kaufman at the height of his career, built with materials and craftsmanship that could never realistically be reproduced, but sentiment alone could not save the house. The city would have to find money, serious money, to buy the property and take on the responsibility of maintaining it. In a community that prided itself on low taxes and minimal government interference, that was a hard sell. The early 60s slipped by without a clear answer. Each year, the mansion decayed a little more. Each year, the developers grew more impatient. Each year, the preservationists grew more desperate. Then, unexpectedly, a possible solution surfaced from an unlikely direction. The city needed land for a new reservoir, a massive water storage facility that would serve Beverly Hills for decades. Engineers studied the topography and concluded that the Greystone property, with its hillside position and natural drainage patterns, was almost perfectly suited for the project. Suddenly, the city had a practical reason to buy the estate that had nothing to do with saving history. The only question was whether the mansion itself would survive the deal. Chapter 10. The day the city stepped in. The deal came together in 1965, and it was not exactly a triumph for preservation. Beverly Hills agreed to purchase the Greystone estate from Paul Trousdale for a sum reportedly around $1.5 million. The motivation was practical, not sentimental. The city needed water storage capacity, and the hillside beneath the mansion's gardens offered an ideal location for a huge underground reservoir. Engineers calculated that the site could hold tens of millions of gallons, enough to supply Beverly Hills' growing population for generations. The mansion itself was almost an afterthought. Work on the reservoir began almost immediately. Crews tore into the lower gardens, excavating immense volumes of earth from the slope that Edward Doheny had reshaped 4 decades earlier. The project became one of the largest public works efforts in the history of Beverly Hills. Trucks rumbled up and down the winding roads, hauling dirt away. Concrete forms rose inside the excavation. The quiet estate where Lucy Doheny had raised her children turned into a construction site, loud with engines and crowded with workers in hard hats. When the reservoir was finished, it was sealed beneath the lawns, invisible from the surface. Its presence was marked only by access hatches and ventilation structures disguised as garden features. Above ground, the terraces were replanted, the paths relaid, and the scars of excavation carefully covered. Within a few years, casual visitors would have no idea that millions of gallons of water sat beneath their feet. But that still left the question of the house. The city's original plans for the mansion were vague. Some officials assumed it would eventually be demolished, cleared away to allow future expansion of the water facility, or simply to eliminate a costly maintenance burden. Others floated the idea that it might be reused for some civic function, a community center, event space, or offices for city departments. Preservationists pushed hard for something more deliberate. They insisted the mansion was a cultural asset, a link to the early story of Beverly Hills, an architectural treasure that now belonged to the public. They collected signatures, packed council meetings, and wrote to every official who might listen, reminding them that Greystone was more than just a shell sitting on top of a reservoir. In 1971, their campaign produced a tangible result. Greystone was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The listing did not guarantee survival. Plenty of registered buildings have still been torn down. But it created an extra layer of protection and, just as important, a public acknowledgement that the mansion mattered. 5 years later, in 1976, the city took the next step. The upper grounds and the mansion were opened as a public park. For the first time in its history, ordinary residents and visitors could walk the terraces where the Doheny children had played, wander through gardens that had once consumed a fortune in upkeep, and stand in front of the limestone facade that Edward Doheny had built to prove his family's worth. The opening was modest. There was no visitor center, no curated exhibits, no formal storytelling about the site's entangled history of oil, scandal, and death. The mansion's interior stayed largely off-limits, its rooms too fragile and too expensive to maintain for regular tours. But the principle was clear. Greystone now belonged to Beverly Hills, and Beverly Hills was committing to keep it. The transformation from private estate to public park was neither smooth nor complete. The city wrestled with maintenance costs year after year. The gardens demanded constant care. The mansion's roof leaked, its windows rotted, its plumbing and electrical systems aged into obsolescence. Each budget cycle brought new repair needs and new arguments over how much the old house deserved. But the bulldozers stayed away. The wrecking ball never reached the hill. The mansion that had survived scandal, a double death, and decades of neglect had acquired a new protector. Not a single family, but an entire city only beginning to understand what it had inherited. Chapter 11. From private home to shared stage. What the city inherited was more than a building. It had taken possession of a ready-made canvas, one that Hollywood had already been painting on for decades. The film crews never left. If anything, public ownership made access easier. Studios no longer had to negotiate with a private family or work around a widow's calendar. They filed permit applications, paid their fees, and rolled trucks up the hill to a location that could transform into almost anything a script demanded. Greystone turned into a chameleon. In one production, it stood in for a prestigious East Coast boarding school. In another, it became a European castle. Crime dramas cast it as the lair of wealthy villains. Comedies used it as the over-the-top home of eccentric millionaires. Period films pushed it backward in time. its Tudor lines convincingly replacing mansions that had already been demolished in real life. The house that Edward Doheny built to nail down one family's identity became, on screen, the home of hundreds of families that never existed. Over the years, the list of productions filmed at Greystone grew into a mini archive of American pop culture. Batman, The Big Lebowski, Spider-Man, Ghostbusters, The Witches of Eastwick, There Will Be Blood. A particularly sharp irony, since that film told the story of an oil tycoon whose hunger for power destroyed everyone around him. Viewers around the world have seen Greystone's staircase, its terraces, its great hall, without realizing they were looking at a real house with a real past, darker than most screenwriters dared to write. The mansion became so familiar on screen that it achieved a strange kind of invisibility. Audiences recognized it without knowing what they were recognizing. The same stone facade appeared in so many different stories, wearing so many different identities, that its actual history dissolved into a blur of fictional roles. Greystone was everywhere, and at the same time nowhere specific. But the cameras were not the only visitors. On weekends, local families started discovering the park. They spread blankets on lawns where construction crews had once dug out the underground reservoir. They pushed strollers along the same paths that Lucy Doheny had walked during her long years of widowhood. Children ran across terraces where the Doheny kids had played nearly 9 decades earlier, their laughter bouncing off the same limestone walls. Soon, wedding couples found the place irresistible. The combination of historic architecture and carefully framed gardens created a backdrop no generic event venue could match. On Saturday afternoons, brides stood under stone archways, veils lifting in the hillside breeze, while photographers captured images that would hang in living rooms for generations. The guest lists rarely included anyone named Doheny, but the family's original goal, to build a setting grand enough for life's biggest moments, lived on in these ceremonies. The city eventually began offering tours. Docents led small groups through rooms that had been closed for decades, explaining the design, the materials, the small details most film crews never bothered to show. They told the story of Edward Doheny's rise from dust-covered prospector to oil baron. They talked about Teapot Dome and the scandal that attached itself to his name, and they addressed carefully but directly the events of February 1929. The deaths that had never been fully explained, the guest room that had stayed shut for so many years. The tours were popular. Visitors came not just for the carved oak and stonework, but for the unanswered questions. They wanted to stand in the hallway where servants had once whispered, to look toward the wing where Ned and Hugh died, to feel for themselves the weight of a history that no coat of paint could remove. By then, Greystone had become something its builder never imagined. A public monument, a working film set, a wedding venue, and a ghost story, all packed into the same 46,000 square feet of limestone and oak. The only question now was whether the house could survive the very attention that had saved it. Chapter 12. The quiet work of repair popularity, it turned out, could be almost as dangerous as neglect. By the late 20th century, Greystone was showing the strain of all its different lives. Decades of film productions had left scars. Heavy lights clamped onto delicate moldings, cables dragged across original hardwood floors, equipment knocking into hand-carved door frames. Thousands of visitors walked the gardens every year, their footsteps slowly wearing down stone paths that had been laid nearly a century earlier. Wedding receptions packed the terraces with rented chairs and tables, catering trucks rumbled over service drives, and sound systems rattled windows that had never been designed to handle that kind of vibration. The city did what it could. Maintenance crews patched sections of roof, cleared gutters, replaced shattered panes of glass. They kept the worst leaks under control and the lawns reasonably green. But Beverly Hills, despite its reputation for wealth, had limited public money earmarked for historic preservation. The annual budget for Greystone covered the basics: electricity, water, mowing, emergency fixes when something failed completely. It did not stretch to the kind of deep, systematic restoration a building of this age, size, and complexity really needed. The gap between what the mansion required and what the city could afford widened a little more every year. Then in 1987, a group of residents decided they could not watch that gap grow any further. They formed the Friends of Greystone, a non-profit organization dedicated solely to preserving and restoring the estate. The founders were not movie moguls or billionaire donors. They were neighbors who walked past the gates, history buffs who knew what the house represented, architects who could read the building like a blueprint, and ordinary citizens who understood that Greystone was quietly slipping away, one crumbling detail at a time. The work began slowly, almost invisibly. The Friends raised money through memberships, donations, and small events. They recruited volunteers willing to spend weekends pulling weeds from between flagstones, gently cleaning soot and grime off stonework, and helping catalog the mansion's condition room by room. They lobbied the city for additional funds and partnered with professional preservation consultants to map out a long-term restoration plan instead of just reacting to emergencies. The challenges were immense. Greystone had been built with materials and techniques that could not simply be swapped out with off-the-shelf modern replacements. The hand-carved oak ceilings needed craftspeople who actually understood historical joinery and carving. The leaded glass windows required artisans trained in traditional glazing and metalwork. The limestone facade, quarried in Indiana and shipped across the country 90 years earlier, could not be patched convincingly with hardware store cement. One restoration project became a symbol for the larger effort. In the library, workers began carefully stripping away layers of paint from the wood paneling, paint that film crews had applied over the decades to change the look of the room for different scenes. Underneath those flat modern colors, they uncovered the original finish, a deep, warm tone that had not been visible since the Doheny family actually lived in the house. The discovery was small, but it hit hard. It proved that Greystone's authentic character had not disappeared. It was still there, buried beneath decades of quick fixes and cosmetic changes, waiting for patient hands to bring it back. Similar moments followed. In storage rooms, volunteers found original hardware that had been removed and replaced with cheaper modern pieces, doorknobs, hinges, and fixtures that matched the architect's original specifications. Historic photographs guided the rebuilding of garden features that had been simplified or erased altogether. Archival research turned up descriptions of the mansion's original furnishings, color schemes, and even how specific rooms had been arranged when the Doheny children were young. The work moved forward piece by piece. A restored ceiling here, a repaired fountain there, new slate laid on a section of roof that had begun to fail, replacement glass cut to match the wavy texture of old panes that had cracked under decades of heat and cold. None of this work made red carpet news. None of it was dramatic. But every small project nudged the mansion a little closer to the way it had once looked and felt. School groups started visiting, not just to hear about the Doheny scandal, but to learn what preservation actually means. Students discovered that saving a place like Greystone demanded chemistry to understand old paints and mortars, engineering to stabilize aging structures, art history to decode original design choices, and plain physical labor to carry out the repairs. They learned that preservation was not about freezing a building in some perfect moment, but about understanding its materials and story well enough to help it survive into the future, one stone, one beam, one careful decision at a time. Chapter 13. What the Mansion Teaches Now. One careful decision at a time. That phrase describes not just the restoration work, but the way Greystone has slowly revealed its meaning to the people who walk through it. A film crew wraps for the day. The lights come down. Cables are coiled. Trucks rumble away down the winding drive. For a few hours, the mansion was a billionaire's penthouse in some streaming drama. Now it is itself again, or as close to itself as a building with this many borrowed identities can be. The camera moves from the bright courtyard, where crew members were drinking coffee an hour earlier, into the dim hallway that leads toward the guest wing. The light shifts. The air feels different here, cooler, heavier, as if the stone walls have absorbed something that never fully leaves. This is the hallway that servants avoided for years after February 1929. This is the approach to the room where Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett were found. The door is no longer sealed shut. Restoration has opened most of the mansion for tours and events. But something lingers in this space that visitors notice again and again. What do we ask them to feel? The narrator poses the question directly. Picture yourself here on that winter night. Picture being Lucy, somewhere else in this enormous house, hearing sounds you cannot quite place. Picture being a servant, loyal to the family, opening that door and realizing that whatever you did next would be examined and questioned for decades. Picture being one of the children, too young to understand why your father was gone, growing up in rooms other people whispered about. The tragedy of Greystone is not only that two men died, it is that their deaths left questions that cannot be answered, wounds that never fully healed, a shadow that no amount of restoration can lift from these walls. But step back outside and the picture changes. On the terrace, Eucalyptus summoned Anitarasim, a young couple poses for engagement photos. The photographer lines them up against the limestone balustrade, the city sprawling below, afternoon light catching the woman's hair. They know nothing about Ned and Hugh. They chose this spot because it is beautiful, because it photographs well, because their friends will react when they see the images online. Near the fountain, a group of teenagers sits on a low wall, staring at their phones, while they wait for a school tour to start. They are restless in the way students often are on field trips. But some of them will remember this place. Some will come back years later with their own children, surprised by how much the mansion has stayed in their minds. An older man walks slowly through the rose garden, pausing at each variety, reading the small markers that name the plants. He comes here every week, a docent explains. His wife loved roses. She died 3 years ago. He finds some kind of peace in this garden, surrounded by beauty that someone else designed, but that he has made part of his own story. The house holds all of these people at once, the grieving widower, the excited couple, the restless students, the film crews who will return tomorrow, and the ghosts, real or imagined, who may never leave. This is what the mansion teaches now. Not just history, not just architecture, not only a cautionary tale about wealth and scandal. It shows how places accumulate meaning the way limestone gathers moss, layer upon layer, story upon story, until the building becomes something its creators could never have imagined. Greystone was built to establish a dynasty. It became a crime scene, a film set, a public park, and finally, a meditation on what we choose to remember, what we choose to preserve, and what we are willing to let go. Chapter 14. Who owns a legacy? What we choose to preserve, and why? The question sounds simple. The answer almost never is. Edward Doheny built Greystone to control a story. He wanted the world to see his family as established, legitimate, and worthy of respect. The mansion was meant to broadcast a single message of arrival. A prospector who struck oil, built an empire, and left behind a monument that would speak on behalf of generations of Dohenys yet to come. That is not the story Greystone tells today. Now the house reads more like a lesson, on the limits of control. Edward could not contain the Teapot Dome scandal. He could not stop the breakdown that consumed Hugh Plunkett. He could not shape whatever happened in that guest room on February 16, 1929. He could not manage the decades of rumor, investigation, and ghost lore that followed. And in the end, he could not dictate what the world would make of the monument he paid for stone by stone. The Doheny name survives on a few plaques and historical markers. Visitors learn the headline facts: oil fortune, political scandal, unexplained deaths. But the family itself has faded to the edge of public memory. The dynasty Edward imagined never really solidified, not because the bloodline ended, but because the house outlived and outgrew the people who built it. Greystone belongs to Beverly Hills now, to the film industry that rents its rooms, to the couples who marry in its gardens, and the school children who shuffle through its halls on field trips. The Dohenys appear as supporting characters in a story that has moved on without them. Is that a tragedy or a triumph? Perhaps it is both. The mansion that was supposed to defend one family's reputation has instead become a shared inheritance. A place where anyone can walk the same terraces, study the same craftsmanship, and wrestle with the same mysteries that have drawn people here for nearly a century. What began as private has become public. What was exclusive has become accessible. The stone walls that were meant to keep the world out now invited in, and yet something has slipped away. The intimate history of the Doheny family. Their small joys, their arguments, their ordinary routines inside this enormous house has been buried beneath scandal and spectacle. We know about the deaths. We know about the corruption trials. We know about the movies and the ghost stories. But we know almost nothing about Lucy's long widowhood, about the children who did their homework here, about the quiet days that filled the years between the dramatic headlines. Every city has buildings like Greystone, maybe not as vast, maybe not as famous, but just as dense with stories on the edge of being forgotten. Old houses, shuttered factories, churches that no longer hold services, theaters with dark marquees. Each one forces a choice: demolish and move on, or preserve and remember. The arguments for demolition are always practical. The land is valuable. Maintenance is expensive. The past, people say, cannot be allowed to choke off the future. Those arguments are not entirely wrong. Cities do have to grow. Budgets are finite. Not every aging structure deserves to be saved. But something important is lost when decisions are made only by spreadsheet. The value of a place like Greystone cannot be summed up in square footage or tax revenue. It lives in the questions the building pushes into the open. Questions about wealth and what it costs, about ambition and what it destroys, about the stories we tell to polish our image and the truths we quietly push into the background. Real wealth, the narrator suggests, is not marble, acreage, or views over the city. It is what we choose to remember. It is the decision to hold on to a connection with the past, even when that past is messy, painful, and impossible to fully untangle. Greystone at sunset. The limestone turns amber in the fading light. Windows that have watched nearly a century of history catch the last rays and hold them for a moment before letting go. One by one, the rooms fall dark, but the house remains. And as long as it stands on that hill, the questions it carries will remain with it. Closing stone that remembers, the questions remain, and maybe that is exactly how it has to be. We began this story with a house on a hill, a mansion that looked like it had slipped out of another century and landed above Beverly Hills. We traced its origins back to a prospector covered in dust and debt, a man who struck oil and then spent the rest of his life trying to turn that dirty fortune into something clean, something permanent, something solid enough to outlast the whispers and the headlines. He failed. And he succeeded. Edward Doheny did not create the dynasty he imagined. His son lived at Greystone for only 5 weeks before dying in circumstances that have never been fully explained. His daughter-in-law spent decades as a widow in a house marked by tragedy. His grandchildren grew up in rooms that strangers gossiped about, their surname forever tied to scandal, politics, and an upstairs crime scene no one could quite agree on. And yet the house survived. That, on its own, is remarkable. It survived neglect and slow decay. It survived developers who saw only lot lines, tax rolls, and demolition permits. It survived decades of film shoots that treated it as a flexible backdrop instead of a memorial. It survived ghost stories, sensational copy, and the simple passage of time that has erased so many mansions from its era without a trace. Today, Greystone stands as something its builder never planned for: a public trust, a shared inheritance, a place where citizens of Beverly Hills and visitors from around the world can walk the same paths, study the same stonework, and turn over the same questions that have hung over this hill since that February night in 1929. What happened in that guest room? We may never know. The official verdict still sits in the record books, but the doubts have never really left. The stone walls keep their own counsel, as they always have. Maybe that is part of what we are really preserving when we save a place like this. Not just architecture, not just a tidy timeline, but mystery itself. The reminder that the past is never fully open to us, that some stories resist tidy endings, that even the grandest monuments refuse to tell us everything we want to hear. The dark story of Greystone does not end in that upstairs room. It continues every time someone walks these grounds and quietly wonders what really happened here. It continues every time a preservation volunteer sands, oils, or refits a piece of original woodwork instead of throwing it away. It continues every time a child, on a school tour, looks up at the limestone facade and feels, maybe for the first time, the weight of history pressing down from something bigger than a textbook.